2001. It was a special era for gaming. Just a year earlier, Sony had launched the PlayStation 2, and of course the excitement surrounding it was unlike anything I'd seen before. Demand was so overwhelming that consoles disappeared from shop shelves almost as quickly as they arrived. Owning one felt like holding a glimpse of the future. And looking back, it's not hard to see why. This wasn't just simply another generation of hardware, it became home to what many still consider some of the greatest games ever made. Metal Gear Solid 2, Silent Hill 2, Max Payne, Jak and Daxter, and Resident Evil Code Veronica, and countless others that would go on to define an entire generation. The catalogue was endless. There was something different about this era, arguably the best we've seen ever in gaming. Games as we know them today strive for bigger worlds and sharper graphics, but back on the PlayStation 2 was truly an era where it chased atmosphere and artistic style choices that made these games carry their own identity. It's the kind of thing that left an impression that stayed with you long after you switched the console off. And in 2001, Capcom released a brand new IP that nobody knew at the time would go on to define an entirely new genre. None other than Devil May Cry.
Let's rock, baby.
Playing Devil May Cry again in 2026 felt surprisingly difficult to describe. It wasn't simply just like replaying an old favourite, it was more like wandering back into something that I'd, already experienced, or somewhere that I've already been. Somewhere I couldn't quite explain. I'm almost certain that I did finish it as a kid, but that was over 20 years ago now. Long enough for memories to easily go amiss and blur into these fragments. But they are moments I remember vividly, yet somehow couldn't tell you exactly how they connected. There was just something incredibly haunting about this game from the moment you boot it up. You're instantly hit with a reminder of times when video games truly had substance. It was common practice for games on the PS2 to have epic interactive menus with cool sound effects compared to today. From the moment you arrive to Mallet Island, it echoes gothic religious horror vibes that aesthetically just completely make up the majority of the atmosphere. Aside from the haunting orchestration, the environment itself perfectly complements the entire setting. It's like an artistic painter spent years carefully perfecting each layer with his brush to paint a vivid, almost lucid world. That something doesn't quite feel right. One thing that immediately caught my attention without any prior knowledge was the development behind this classic. The soundtrack itself, which resembled something familiar to Capcom's most famous Resident Evil title, Resident Evil 4, After some research, I learned that the first Devil May Cry started development as an early version of Resident Evil 4, and Kamiya's team was trying to reinvent Resident Evil for the PS2, but the prototype became too fast and theatrical and action-heavy for the series. But rather than discard it, Capcom separated it into a new game, which became yours truly, Devil May Cry. It's truly fascinating to think that the entire DMC series was born from one of the best games ever made, and even though they share similarities, both do feel like separate worlds, all whilst keeping Capcom's signature game design format. Like so many PS2 classics, Devil May Cry opens with one of those unforgettable FMVs that immediately just sets the tone. You're taken straight to like a monologue or a legend of the Dark Knight Sparda, a demon who awoke to justice, rebelled against his own kind, sealed away the demon emperor Mundus, and in doing so, saved humanity.
He quietly reigned the human world and continued to preserve harmony until his death. He became a legend. The legendary Dark Knight, Sparda.
It is like an opening that all the games seemed to do so well back then. Soul Reaver, The Legacy of Kain, and Metal Gear Solid, they all drop you straight into a world that already felt historic and had been unfolding long before you arrived. The main character is Dante, one of gaming's most coolest protagonists, and somehow Capcom just effortlessly makes him cool without trying to force it. The guy runs a shop in a demon hunting business and just so happens to carry an enormous sword.
Even as a child, I had powers. There's demonic blood in me.
It's so big!
And he also dual wields two handguns called Ebony and Ivory, and dresses like an urban goth, and deals with demons using little more than sarcasm and complete confidence whilst he slashes his way through. His entire motivations, though, stem from the loss of his mother, who died protecting him and his twin brother Virgil when they were children.
He's the one that took the life of my mother, my brother, Shirley. My mother used to always tell me that my father was a man who fought for me.
This guy loves his mom.
Because you look like my mother.
Dante!
Don't come any closer, you devil! You may look like my mother, but you're nowhere close to her!
I mean, unless it's someone who looks like your mum but tries to kill you before deciding to save you later on. That being Trish, who perfectly captures the aesthetics of the early 2000s. Who is a demon created by Mundus, the very emperor Dante's father Sparda defeated thousands of years earlier, who's responsible for Dante's mother's death, and our boy Virgil's corruption, who goes under the guise of a demon called Nilo Angelo. The funny thing is, I completely forgot he was even in the first game. I mean, it has been that long since I played the entire DMC series, and the last time I played DMC 2 and 3 was so long ago, I can't even recall if I even played 4. But I do remember a while back being recommended by the DMC fandom to play DMC 5. So I've got a lot of replaying to do, and honestly I'm excited to share what pieces I can put back together to record these amazing games in my own perspective. Anyway, Nilo Angelo is actually Virgil, Dante's twin brother, brainwashed and enslaved by Mundus after their childhood, who appears several times in the story. Everything ultimately builds towards Mundus himself in an epic conclusion that would later expand to the dark reaches of the underworld that would still later consume Earth, continuing into the series. Devil May Cry tells a surprisingly simple story, but one that's memorable because of its characters, and its atmosphere, and just its simplicity alone. First entry nails everything, and the gameplay mechanics aren't too far behind in merging this into an overall exhilarating experience. Every game falls into a genre, and Devil May Cry is what most people would call a hack and slash. Now technically, it didn't invent the term because hack and slash has been around for years, even before video games in things like Dungeons and Dragons. But I think it's fair to say that Hideki Kamiya turned it into what people recognise today. You can see bits of Devil May Cry in so many action games that came afterwards, and even 20 odd years later, it's still one of the first games that people think about when you mention this genre. After some digging and noticing that people going back to the first game after playing the new ones, one thing that surprised me was just how simple everything is. And I don't mean that in a bad way either. You're not swapping between 10 different weapons or trying to remember about 500 different combos. You've got a handful of weapons and each one feels completely different. And because of that, you actually end up using all of them instead of just sticking with one favourite for the whole game. You start with Force Edge, which is the sword Dante inherited from his dad Sparda. Looking back, it's quite funny because if you're new to the series, you're probably expecting him to be carrying Rebellion, but thanks to Capcom's slight retcon changing bits of the story over the years, this is actually the only game where Force Edge gets to be Dante's main sword. And then you have Alastor, and honestly, I don't think I'll ever get bored of the scene when you acquire it. Dante walks into this hallway, sees a giant sword sticking out of a statue, and instead of thinking, maybe I shouldn't touch that, he just grabs it, and then the next thing you know, he's skewered straight through the chest. And then he just, it looks like he's dead, and then all of a sudden he gets up and then pulls the thing back out and carries on with his day. Peak PS2. Gameplay wise though, this is where everything starts opening up. You finally get Devil Trigger, lightning attacks, faster movements, and later on abilities like Air Raid that completely change how you approach certain fights. It doesn't suddenly become a different game, it just feels like you've finally got the tools to start bullying the demons instead of the other way around. Eventually though, later through the game, you end up restoring the Sword of Sparda itself. And I really like how Capcom handled this, because there's only 23 missions in the whole game, and by mission 18, after Dante's final fight with Virgil, you finally get the second half of the perfect amulet. That's what restores Force Edge back into the legendary Sword of Sparda. Looking back, it's actually a really cool twist, because the sword you've been carrying around since the very start was Sparda's sword all along. It was just incomplete. Then you've got Eye Thrift. Honestly, these things are brilliant. You find them tucked away in Mission 9, and getting to them is half of the fun, because you got to make your way across these tiny floating platform things, and I'll talk more about the level design later on if I can ever figure out how to structure these bloody videos properly. Thanks, Autism. They're an absolute blast to use. Instead of swinging a sword around, you're just decking demons with giant flaming fists, and every punch does a lot of damage. Inferno especially became one of my favourite moves in the game, because yeah, it absolutely rinses your Devil Trigger meter, but when a boss suddenly loses half of its health, you like to use it quite often. It's expensive, but worth it. Now nowadays, every game seems to throw skill points at you for just simply progressing, but here you actually have to think about what you want. The funny thing is, I always ended up changing my mind several times after dying. Air Hike was always one I ended up grabbing fairly early because it's just useful for everything. It lets Dante double jump and makes platforming much easier, and more importantly, makes some of the airborne bosses far less annoying. Griffon is probably the best example, because you fight this oversized lightning pigeon about 3 different times throughout the game, each fight throwing a few new tricks at you until Mundus basically gets fed up with him and bins him off for the rest of the game for being terrible. Some people probably don't like this about the first game, but instead of introducing 20 different bosses that are unique, you'll only ever see once, in the original it keeps bringing them back. Phantom, Griffin, Nightmare, they all come back. Every fight builds on the last one, because I think Capcom already knows that we've sort of learned the basics and now it's time to make our life very miserable with the last boss. Phantom is the first proper boss that you'll encounter, and it's cool because before you meet him you see little tiny spiders on the floor, just knowing he's lingering around. So yeah, he's basically a giant spider crossed with a scorpion, and he's built like a tank. You can absolutely go in swinging, but you just can't mash buttons because you'll probably spend most of the fight getting flattened or just hitting his hard shell. You quickly realise you've got to pick up your moments to aim for his weak spots and actually pay attention to what he's doing. Progression's not so hard because there's chances to farm red orbs in many areas. If you got stuck, you could just clear out a room, leave and come back and do it again, and being near a divinity statue, that can really help. It's not like grinding because sometimes, it's a good way to save up, maybe for another skill or a blue orb, and maybe finally enough for Inferno. I wasn't quite sure what to expect. Dying a few times in the game also made me understand that sometimes you need to go away and carefully think about what you're buying for the next section. Speaking of blue orbs, I still love how simple the progression system is. Find 4 fragments and you get another chunk of health. Nice and easy. Purple orbs increase your devil trigger, which becomes ridiculously useful later on. And then you've got yellow orbs, basically extra lives. I know if Devil May Cry released today, people would probably lose their minds over that, but honestly, that's just how games used to be. If you died, you either used a yellow orb or a loaded save. Checkpoints just weren't a thing back then. It relied solely on you to make sure the game was saved. And I know, try do that in the advent of an unplanned power cut. And that brings me into the divinity statues. Every time I found one, it reminded me of walking into a Resident Evil safe room. You save 1 minute, you can spend your money, red orbs or whatever you're doing, save your game, have a little breather, but the second you leave, Capcom's probably got something horrible waiting around the next corner. You don't really need to buy yellow orbs anyway. Once you understand how Devil May Cry works, dying often isn't really a thing. Not unless that is if you're playing Dark Souls. For me, the purple orbs were brilliant because the extended duration of the Devil Trigger really does help against tougher bosses, especially against Nightmare. And believe me, Nightmare is a literal nightmare.
Fatality.
3 times you encounter it, and what I can only describe as the most annoying fortified bioweapon sent straight from hell. For me, this is easily the hardest boss in the game. It constantly fires projectiles at you, including this stupid spiky arm that never seems to leave you alone. All while you're trying to hit these little dials that force Nightmare out of this liquid form and expose its solid body. That's when you finally get the chance to attack these exposed cores and actually do some proper damage. Abilities like Air Raid, which lets Dante fly around in Devil Trigger, are great for avoiding most of these projectiles, but actually dealing damage is the most important part. This is where I'd switch straight over to Ifrift and just spam Inferno. It absolutely rinses your trigger meter, as I explained before, but honestly it's one of the best investments you can buy because it just slaps most enemies. Getting too close to Nightmare though isn't always a good idea. Sometimes it'll literally drag you into another world where you're forced to fight rehashed versions of previous bosses. As annoying as that sounds, it actually can work in your favour because if you're running low on health, beating them gives you a chance to recover before being thrown back into, well, a nightmare. That's also why it's worth carrying a few consumables around with you, like Vital Stars that restore your health when things start going horribly wrong, and Devil Stars that refill your Devil Trigger meter, and Holy Water as well, which deals damage to every enemy on screen. Personally, I never found Holy Water worth spending loads of red orbs on, but if a boss is hanging on by a sliver of health, sometimes that little bit of extra damage is really all you need. Then finally you've got Untouchable, and for me this is probably the best item you can get in the game. It makes Dante completely invincible for a short time. If I remember rightly, I'm pretty sure it fills your Devil Trigger as well. And to be fair, all of these mechanics come together really nicely, and by the time you finally reach Mundus, it genuinely feels like everything has been building towards the one moment. The difficulty ramps up at the final battle, and it just reminds me of older games when the last boss was actually expected to take you a few attempts. The fight itself is split into 3 stages. The first stage has you battling Mundus in space whilst flying around in Devil Trigger, dodging projectiles and just trying to survive. The best strategy I found was just shooting the little orbs he summons because they refill your Devil Trigger meter, which is kind of like mandatory. Letting you unleash one of the coolest attacks in the game where Dante just transforms into a dragon. It absolutely rips chunks off Mundus' health bar. On this playthrough, I didn't really bother farming loads of red orbs, to be honest. I mean, I did it earlier in the game, but honestly after a while it just became a bit tedious. Personally, I'd just buy Devil Stars, which made keeping my Devil Trigger topped up a lot, so this was a lot easier during the fight. You don't have to dodge and lose health. The second stage does slow things down a little, and personally I found it much easier to avoid his attacks. The same idea applies here as well, keep hitting those sigil orbs to refill your Devil Trigger, because now you're wielding the fully restored Sword of Sparda, and Dante can stay in Devil Trigger while fighting Mundus and fire back his own powerful projectiles. But it's honestly the only time you can use this sword with the actual Devil Trigger, because usually it's not tied to it. One little detail I always liked is that if you're close to dying, Mundus will actually sometimes release a fire dragon that you can kill for a small bit of health. It isn't much, but it can be just enough to keep the fight going. Then in the final phase, Trish lends Dante her power, combining it with his own and charging Ebony and Ivory to ridiculous levels. It is a satisfying finish because you get to unload each shot into Mundus before finally sending him back to whatever dark corner of the underworld he crawled out of.
It looks like we have a winner.
Jackpot.
Looking back, the combat in Devil May Cry is probably the simplest in the entire series, but I honestly think that that's part of its charm. It never overwhelms you with mechanics, it just gives you a handful of really satisfying tools that lets you master them at your own pace, and somehow over 20 years later, it's still ridiculously fun to play. I wouldn't really say it's aged like milk. If anything, it's kind of aged like a fine wine, it's got an acquired taste. Aside from Ebony and Ivory, you can also find a new other firearm variation throughout the game. There's a grenade launcher if you fancy a bit more damage at the expense of speed, Nightmare, which is a powerful plasma weapon that sadly drains your Devil Trigger, although I'll be honest, I don't think really I ever used it because of that reason. And then you've got the simple shotgun, which is brilliant up close, and finally the absolute terrible underwater needle gun. I don't know how Capcom thought underwater combat was a good idea, but thankfully it doesn't overstay its welcome. What I don't understand is why Capcom just didn't make it so when you fall into the water you can use your other weapons like they did in this section. What makes combat work so well is that your guns are integrated into the movement rather than treated as separate weapons. You're constantly switching between your sword and firearms without thinking about it, and because there aren't dozens of different weapons to choose from, everything really does have its place. Although it would be nice to have a quick slot button to be able to transfer to different weapons and styles a lot more easier. Whilst limited, you get to settle into a playstyle that suits you, and together they give you everything you need to deal with not only the bosses but the wide variety of enemies you'll soon come across, each feeling more suited to one weapon than another. The camera is probably one of the most divisive parts of Devil May Cry today. Most modern games follow the formula of third-person cameras with, behind the shoulder, or first persons for shooters and other games. Triggers to aim, and everyone's completely familiar with it. But back on the PlayStation 2, a lot of games still relied on fixed cinematic camera angles, especially horror games. I think the obscurity is what added to the uncertainty of what was waiting around the corner that made it so special. And considering Devil May Cry started life as a Resident Evil game, it makes a lot of sense. Now, don't get me wrong, it can be absolutely frustrating. Sometimes enemies attack on and off from the screen, and there isn't really much you can do about it. Other times the camera decides to swing around at the worst possible moments, or you're trying to cross something like this bridge by jumping across floating platforms, only to miss because the angle suddenly changes. But despite all that, I actually think it works more often than it doesn't. I think those fixed angles themselves create something really striking in terms of cinematic quality throughout the castle itself and during combat. I never really found an issue with these camera angles because I understood what was going on, because the camera usually does give you a good view of the area. Just look at Metal Gear Solid 1 for example. It's really useful in certain areas, like games like Silent Hill. You know, it's not perfect, but it fits the atmosphere Devil May Cry was going for. Some games are remembered because they followed the trends of their time. Others are remembered because they helped create them. And I think Devil May Cry comfortably falls into the second category. I think it goes without saying, like a lot of Capcom games, progression revolves around exploration. Some doors stay locked until you've collected enough red orbs, others won't open until every enemy in the room is dead. And a lot of the time you're backtracking to pick up a key item that'll unlock another part of the castle and anywhere else across the map. If you played pretty much any Capcom game, you already know the drill. The funny thing is, I never really minded the backtracking. Returning to places you'd already visited usually meant something had changed. Maybe there were new enemies waiting for you, maybe the environment had shifted, or just maybe the game had opened to a completely different route. It always felt like Mallet Island was changing alongside your progress. Even the underwater section, which I'll admit doesn't really need to exist in this game. It never overstays its welcome though, nonetheless. It's short, and there's only a handful of obstacles to swim past, and before you know it you're back on dry land. I really can't complain. As the game goes on, it almost feels like you're slowly breaking through reality itself in order to reach Mundus. You pass through mirrors, climbing to paintings, descend further beneath the island and eventually make your way into the underworld. It actually reminded me a little bit of Super Mario 64, where paintings, you could just jump in them and you'd be transported into a whole new world. There are a few simple puzzles scattered throughout as well. The hedge maze, where following the glowing light just sends you back to the beginning, caught me out the first time. And while none of the puzzles are particularly difficult, and not in the many, they help break up the combat without slowing the game down too much. Then after everything you've been through, the game ends with one last escape from Mallet Island as the whole place begins to collapse. Naturally, Dante escapes in the most Devil May Cry way possible, or rather in typical Capcom fashion, by flying on an aircraft to escape. Looking back after all these years, I can completely understand why Devil May Cry became such an important game. It isn't the biggest game in the series, and it isn't the longest, and mechanically it was refined by its sequels, but there's something about this first game that none of the others quite managed to recreate in my opinion, and I believe that was the atmosphere and the feel, the gothic horror roots. Maybe it's because you can still feel the Resident Evil DNA running through every corridor of Mallet Island before eventually DMC became its own thing. Whatever it is, Devil May Cry has an identity all of its own, and over 25 years later, I still think it's one of the finest action games Capcom have ever made. And I genuinely recommend that you give it a go if you've never played it. And with that being said, please feel free to subscribe and like and support the channel. I mean, not many people do, so if you can, I'll be grateful. And yeah, thanks for watching. Until we meet again.
Okay, great. Where's the place? We'll be right there. This one has the password. Sounds heavy.
Okay, let's get it over with in 10 minutes. Can't let a single one of those suckers live.
5 minutes.
More than enough.